The courtroom doors swung open, and every conversation died mid-sentence. My father let out that familiar bitter laugh, the same one he'd used when I told him I was enlisting. My mother's face twisted into that look of quiet shame she'd perfected over the years, as if my very existence was a personal embarrassment. But when Judge Harrison lifted his eyes from the paperwork and saw me standing there in my marine dress blues, his pen clattered to the bench. His voice came out as barely a whisper, "Dear God, is that really Lieutenant Colonel Daniels? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every head in that Riverside County courtroom turned toward me like I was some kind of apparition. My brother Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap next to the crisp red and gold of my military uniform. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. Even the bailiff straightened his posture instinctively. I hadn't worn these dress blues in 3 years. Not since my retirement ceremony at Camp Pendleton, where I'd been honored for 22 years of service that included 3 combat tours and a Purple Heart that most people back home never knew existed. The jacket still fit perfectly, the ribbons and medals catching the fluorescent courthouse lights like small pieces of my soul made visible. My parents, Richard and Patricia Daniels, sat at the plaintiff's table looking exactly as I remembered them from my childhood, him perpetually disappointed, her perpetually worried about what the neighbors might think. They'd aged, sure, but their expressions hadn't changed one bit. The same expressions they'd worn when I graduated boot camp at Paris Island and they didn't show up. The same ones when I made sergeant and called to share the news to an empty voicemail box. The same ones when I came home wounded from Helmand Province and found out they'd told everyone in Millbrook that I was taking some time to figure myself out. "Your Honor," my father's attorney began, his voice cutting through the tension, "we weren't expecting the defendant to appear in costume." Judge Harrison's gray eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "Counsel, that's a United States Marine Corps uniform, not a costume. And unless I'm mistaken, those aren't participation ribbons." His voice carried the kind of authority that comes from 3 decades on the bench and, I suspected, his own military background. I took a measured step forward, my polished black shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision. 22 years of morning inspections don't just disappear because you trade dress blues for civilian clothes. Lieutenant Colonel Amelia Daniels reporting as ordered, Your Honor. The formality of it seemed to snap something into place in the courtroom. This wasn't just another family squabble over property lines or inheritance disputes. This was something else entirely. My mother, Patricia, clutched her pearl necklace, the one she'd worn to every important family event I'd missed while serving overseas, and whispered something to my father that made his jaw tighten even more. Probably something about me making a scene or showing off. They'd never understood that the uniform wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up. About standing for something bigger than yourself, even when the people who should have supported you most turned their backs instead. "Mrs. Daniels," the judge addressed my mother directly, "were you aware that your daughter served with distinction in Operation Enduring Freedom?" My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. My father just stared at the table, probably calculating how much this public humiliation was going to cost him at the Millbrook Country Club. The truth was, they knew almost nothing about my service. They knew I'd been in the military, the way you might know someone works in business or with computers. Vague. Dismissible. They'd never asked about the months I spent training Afghan female police officers. Never asked about the convoy I'd led through Taliban territory to deliver medical supplies to a remote village. Never asked about the IED that had taken out my Humvee and left me with a reconstructed shoulder and a Purple Heart. They'd been too busy being embarrassed that their daughter had chosen combat boots over wedding heels, a rifle over a rolling pin, service to country over service to their expectations. "We're here today," Judge Harrison continued, his voice growing more incredulous by the minute, "because the plaintiffs claimed their daughter abandoned the family property on Sycamore Road. Is that correct?" My father's attorney nodded vigorously. "Yes, Your Honor. The defendant has shown complete disregard for family property and responsibilities for over 2 decades. I almost smiled. Complete disregard. If they only knew about the mortgage payments I'd been making from my military salary since 2008 when Dad's construction business went under. If they only knew about the property taxes I'd quietly covered when Mom's medical bills from her surgery wiped out their savings. If they only knew about the insurance premiums I'd been paying to keep their precious family home protected while I was dodging mortars in Kandahar. But they didn't know. Because they'd never asked. Because asking would have meant acknowledging that their daughter, the one who'd disappointed them by choosing duty over domesticity, might actually be worth something after all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Judge Harrison was studying me now with the kind of intense focus that made me straighten my shoulders automatically. Lieutenant Colonel, do you have documentation regarding your claims to this property? Yes, Your Honor. I reached into my briefcase, the same one I'd carried through 3 war zones, and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. 20 years of mortgage payments, property tax receipts, insurance premiums, and maintenance records. All in my name. All paid from my military salary and pension. The sound of my father's sharp intake of breath was audible across the courtroom. This was going to be a very interesting morning. 3 weeks earlier, I was in my small apartment in Ocean View, California, trying to assemble an IKEA bookshelf that seemed designed by someone who'd never actually seen furniture before. My German Shepherd, Ranger, was sprawled across the living room floor, watching me struggle with Swedish engineering like it was his personal entertainment. The knock at my door came just after noon on a Tuesday. I wasn't expecting anyone, hell, I barely knew anyone in this coastal town yet. Moving here after retirement had been my attempt at starting fresh, away from the military base housing and the constant reminders of a career that had ended not with fanfare, but with a medical discharge and a pension that made civilian life possible but not exactly luxurious. Through the peephole, I saw a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, wearing a crisp uniform and holding an official-looking envelope. Process server. My stomach dropped before I even opened the door. Amelia Daniels? His voice cracked slightly, probably his first week on the job. That's me. You've been served. He thrust the envelope at me like it might explode, then practically sprinted back to his Honda Civic. I stood there for a moment, staring at the return address, Riverside County Superior Court, Millbrook, California. My hometown. The place I hadn't set foot in since my father told me not to bother coming to my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago because my presence would upset the family dynamic. Ranger padded over, sensing my tension, and pressed his warm bulk against my leg. 22 years in the Marines, including 3 combat deployments, and a legal envelope from my hometown made my hands shake more than incoming mortar fire ever had. I tore it open right there in the doorway. Case No. CV 2024-891 Daniels vs. Daniels petition for quiet title and declaratory relief. The legal jargon was thick, but the core message hit me like a sledgehammer. Richard and Patricia Daniels, my parents, were suing me for full ownership of the family property at 1247 Sycamore Road. The house where I'd grown up. The house my great-grandfather had built with his own hands after returning from World War II. The house that my grandmother had left to me in her will, much to my parents' fury. According to their petition, I had abandoned the property and failed to maintain familial obligations, therefore forfeiting any legal claim to it. They wanted the court to declare them the rightful owners and award them monetary damages for years of neglect and financial burden. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for it to make sense. Abandonment? I'd been paying the mortgage for 16 years. Neglect? I'd hired contractors to fix the roof, replace the plumbing, and update the electrical system, all while stationed at various bases around the world. Financial burden? The only financial burden my parents had regarding that house was cashing the monthly checks I sent to cover utilities and maintenance. Ranger whined softly, picking up on my distress. I sank onto my couch, still holding the papers, and tried to process what I was reading. The petition painted a picture of a selfish daughter who'd run off to play soldier, leaving her aging parents to manage a deteriorating property they couldn't afford to maintain. It claimed I'd been unreachable for years and had shown no interest in family responsibilities. It described the house as falling into disrepair due to defendant's willful neglect and abandonment. Every word was a lie wrapped in legal language. I grabbed my phone and dialed my brother Jake's number, the only family contact I still had. It went straight to voicemail. His voice, professionally cheerful: "You've reached Jake Daniels, Regional Sales Manager at Pinnacle Solutions. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. Jake, it's Amelia. Call me back. Now. It's about Mom and Dad and the house." I tried calling my parents directly for the first time in 3 years. Dad answered on the 4th ring. "What do you want, Amelia?" "No hello. No how are you?" Just cold, flat hostility. "I want to know why I'm holding a lawsuit that says I abandoned Grandma's house." A long pause. Then, "Because you did abandon it. You've been gone for 20 years, playing army, while your mother and I dealt with everything here." Playing army? The words came out sharper than I intended. "Dad, I've been serving my country. And I've been paying for that house since 2008 when your business went under. Every mortgage payment, every tax bill, every insurance premium. We never asked you to do that. You never had to ask. I did it because it's family property. Because Grandma wanted me to have it. Your grandmother was old and confused when she wrote that will. That house should have gone to me, not some daughter who couldn't be bothered to come home for Christmas." The familiar guilt tried to creep in, the same guilt he'd been laying on me since I enlisted. But this time, it bounced off like rain on steel. "I couldn't come home for Christmas because I was in Afghanistan, Dad. Building schools and training female police officers and trying to make the world a little bit safer. Don't give me that hero speech, Amelia. You chose the military over your family. Now live with the consequences." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, 20 years of unspoken hurt crystallizing into something hard and sharp in my chest. Ranger rested his head on my knee, his brown eyes full of the kind of unconditional loyalty I'd never gotten from my own blood relatives. That evening, I called my old commander, Colonel Martinez, now retired and living in San Diego. After explaining the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "Amelia, you know you don't have to fight this alone, right? You've got documentation going back decades. You've got witnesses. Hell, you've got a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star that prove exactly what kind of person you are. This isn't about medals, sir. Isn't it? Seems to me it's about respect. About standing up to people who've never appreciated what you've sacrificed for others, including them." After I hung up, I pulled out my laptop and started going through my files. Bank statements showing mortgage payments from my military account. Property tax receipts from the Riverside County assessor. Insurance premiums paid through USAA. Contractor invoices for repairs I'd authorized while deployed to Helmand Province. The paper trail was overwhelming. I had everything. But as I sat there surrounded by evidence of my financial responsibility, I realized this wasn't really about money or property ownership. This was about something much deeper. This was about my parents finally having the chance to erase me from the family narrative entirely. To claim that their daughter who'd chosen service over suburbia had never really contributed anything at all. The next morning, I called the courthouse and confirmed my court date, 3 weeks from Thursday. Then I walked to my closet and stared at the garment bag I hadn't touched since my retirement ceremony. My dress blue uniform hung there in the darkness, ribbons and medals catching the light from the hallway. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Combat Action Ribbon. The visible proof of everything my family had chosen to ignore for 2 decades. I had 3 weeks to prepare for a battle I'd never wanted to fight. But as I stood there looking at that uniform, I realized something. I might not have wanted this fight, but I was damn well going to finish it. The drive back to Millbrook took 4 hours, but it felt like traveling through 20 years of buried memories. I hadn't been on this stretch of Interstate 15 since 2019, when I'd come home for what I thought would be a reconciliation after my second Purple Heart. Instead, I'd found my parents hosting a barbecue where they introduced me to neighbors as our daughter who's been traveling for work. traveling for work. As if 3 combat deployments were an extended business trip. The town looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. Main Street still had Murphy's hardware store and the diner with the Crooked and Millbrook Cafe sign, but there were empty storefronts now where I remembered thriving businesses. The economic downturn had hit small Central California towns hard, and Millbrook was no exception. I drove past my old high school, where I'd been valedictorian and captain of the soccer team before the guidance counselor told me that military service was probably not realistic for someone like me. Someone like me. A girl from a working-class family who dreamed bigger than the narrow confines of small-town expectations. The Daniels family had lived in Millbrook for 4 generations. My great-grandfather, Thomas Daniels, had settled here after World War II, using his GI benefits to buy 40 acres of orange groves on the outskirts of town. He'd built the house on Sycamore Road with his own hands, timber by timber, a modest but solid structure that reflected his belief that home was something you earned through sweat and dedication. My grandfather, James, had expanded the property, adding a workshop and converting some of the orange groves to residential lots during the suburban boom of the 1970s. He'd been a quiet man who worked for the county water department and saved every penny, believing that land was the only real security a family could have. My father, Richard, had inherited both the property and the responsibility that came with it, but he'd never quite measured up to his father's steady competence. Where Grandpa James had been methodical and careful with money, Dad was impulsive and prone to get-rich-quick schemes. His construction business had done well during the housing boom of the early 2000s, but he'd overextended himself, taking on projects he couldn't complete and spending money he didn't have on equipment he couldn't afford. My mother, Patricia, had grown up as Patricia Walsh in the nicer part of town, where her father owned the Ford dealership. She'd married Dad when they were both 22, expecting a life of suburban comfort that never quite materialized. Instead, she got a husband whose business ventures always seemed to collapse just when success was within reach, and a daughter who refused to follow the script she'd written in her head. I was supposed to marry Tommy Henderson, whose father owned the largest ranch in the county. I was supposed to give them grandchildren and Sunday dinners and a daughter who stayed close to home. Instead, I gave them a girl who asked too many questions, earned a full scholarship to UC Berkeley, and announced at her high school graduation party that she was enlisting in the Marines. The fight that followed was legendary in our family. Dad had screamed about throwing away opportunities and embarrassing the family name. Mom had cried and asked where she'd gone wrong. My brother Jake, 3 years older and safely established in his business degree program, had just shaken his head and said I was going through a phase. But it wasn't a phase. It was a calling. I'd felt it the first time I saw a female Marine recruiter speak at a career fair my junior year of high school. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been everything I wanted to be: confident, capable, respected for her competence rather than her compliance. She'd told stories about leading supply convoys through hostile territory, about training other women to defend themselves, about serving something larger than personal ambition. The Marine Corps doesn't care if you're male or female, she'd said. It cares if you can do the job. And if you can prove you belong, you'll earn respect that nobody can ever take away from you. That's what I'd been searching for my entire life, the chance to earn something through my own merit, rather than having my worth determined by my willingness to meet other people's expectations. My grandmother, Elizabeth Daniels, had been the only family member who understood. She'd pulled me aside after the recruitment speech fight and told me about her own dreams of becoming a nurse during World War II, dreams she'd abandoned when she married Grandpa Thomas. I spent 60 years wondering what I might have accomplished, she'd said, her weathered hands holding mine. Don't you spend one day wondering the same thing? When she died in 2015, her will had shocked everyone. She'd left the Sycamore Road property to me, not to my father as everyone expected. The house, the remaining 5 acres of land, the workshop where Grandpa Thomas had taught me to change oil and fix engines, all of it came to me, along with a letter that I'd read so many times I could recite it from memory. Amelia, this land represents 4 generations of Daniel's family sweat and sacrifice. Your great-grandfather built this house because he believed in the American dream, that hard work and dedication could create something lasting for the next generation. Your grandfather expanded it because he believed in family responsibility. Your father inherited it but never understood its true value. You earned it by becoming the kind of person who serves others before herself. Take care of it, not because it's valuable property, but because it represents the best of what our family can be." My parents had contested the will immediately, claiming that Grandma Elizabeth had been suffering from dementia and didn't understand what she was doing. The probate court had rejected their claim after reviewing her medical records, which showed she'd been mentally sharp until the day she died. But they'd never forgiven me for what they saw as manipulation of a sick old woman. The truth was simpler and more painful. Grandma Elizabeth had left the property to the grandchild who'd proven she could be trusted with something bigger than her own comfort. For 9 years, I'd maintained that trust from thousands of miles away. When the mortgage payments came due, I paid them from my military account. When the property taxes increased, I covered the difference. When the roof leaked during the winter storms of 2018, I hired contractors to replace it while I was deployed to Syria. When the ancient plumbing finally gave up in 2020, I arranged for a complete renovation from my base in North Carolina. I'd done all of this quietly, without fanfare or recognition, because that's what family responsibility meant to me. Not the obligation to stay close to home and follow predetermined paths, but the commitment to protect what previous generations had built, even when protecting it meant serving far from home. My parents had accepted my financial support for years without acknowledgement, let alone gratitude. They'd lived in the house rent-free, benefited from my mortgage payments and maintenance expenditures, and told their friends that they were helping Amelia keep the family property rather than admitting the truth, that their daughter, the one they'd disowned for choosing service over suburbia, had been supporting them financially for over a decade. Now they wanted to erase that history entirely. They wanted the court to declare that I'd abandoned my responsibilities, that I'd never contributed anything meaningful to the family legacy, that my years of quiet sacrifice had been nothing more than selfishness disguised as duty. As I pulled into the parking lot of the Millbrook Inn, the only hotel in town that didn't make me feel like I was staying in someone's spare bedroom, I realized that this legal battle was about much more than property ownership. It was about the fundamental question of what constitutes family loyalty, and whether service to country could coexist with love for home. Tomorrow, I would have to prove in a court of law that 22 years of military service hadn't made me a stranger to my own family. I would have to demonstrate that choosing duty over domesticity hadn't disqualified me from the inheritance my grandmother had intended. But tonight, I just sat in my rental car and stared at the mountains beyond town, the same peaks I'd looked at as a restless teenager dreaming of something beyond the horizons of small-town life. I'd traveled the world in service to my country. Now I had to fight for the right to come home. The hotel room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams, but it gave me the privacy I needed to dig through the military records I'd brought with me. Ranger had claimed the single chair, leaving me to spread documents across the polyester bedspread like I was planning a tactical operation. Which, in a way, I was. What my parents didn't know, what they'd never bothered to learn, was exactly what I'd accomplished during my 22 years in uniform. To them, I was simply their daughter who'd joined the military and disappeared into some vague world they couldn't comprehend. They knew I'd been deployed multiple times, but they thought deployment meant sitting safely on a base somewhere, probably doing paperwork. The reality was significantly different. My first deployment to Iraq in 2007 had been as a logistics coordinator, managing supply convoys that kept forward operating bases stocked with everything from ammunition to medical supplies. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was critical and dangerous. The roads between Baghdad and Fallujah were lined with IEDs, and every convoy was a potential target. I'd learned to read the terrain like a book, to spot the signs that meant trouble, the absence of children playing in normally busy areas, the way dogs acted nervous, the fresh dirt that might conceal an explosive device. During that deployment, I'd volunteered for the Female Engagement Team, a specialized unit that worked directly with Iraqi women and children in areas where male Marines couldn't operate effectively due to cultural restrictions. We'd go into villages to provide medical care, assess humanitarian needs, and gather intelligence from women who were often the eyes and ears of their communities but had no way to communicate with male soldiers. It was dangerous work that required not just military training but cultural sensitivity, language skills, and the ability to build trust with people who had every reason to view American forces with suspicion. I'd learned basic Arabic, studied Islamic customs, and spent hours with cultural advisors learning how to navigate complex social situations where a single misstep could endanger both my team and the civilians we were trying to help. My second deployment to Afghanistan in 2011 had been even more challenging. I'd been promoted to captain by then, leading a team of 12 Marines responsible for training Afghan National Police officers in Helmand province. The region was a Taliban stronghold where suicide bombings were routine and trust was a luxury that could get you killed. The female police officers I trained faced death threats simply for showing up to work. Their families were targeted, their homes were bombed, and several of them were murdered for the crime of believing that women deserved to participate in their country's future. But they kept coming, kept training, kept fighting for a vision of Afghanistan where their daughters might grow up with opportunities they'd never had. Training them required me to be part instructor, part bodyguard, part counselor, and part diplomat. I had to be proficient with multiple weapons systems, fluent in tactical procedures, and sensitive to the cultural dynamics that made every interaction a potential minefield. I had to earn the respect of male Afghan officers who'd never taken orders from a woman, while simultaneously building the confidence of female recruits who'd been taught their entire lives that women were too weak for police work. The Bronze Star I'd earned during that deployment came from an incident that still woke me up some nights. A suicide bomber had targeted the police training facility during graduation ceremonies for our first all-female recruit class. The explosion had brought down part of the building and started fires throughout the complex. While most personnel evacuated, I'd gone back into the burning structure 3 times to pull out wounded Afghan officers, including 2 women who would have died without immediate medical attention. The citation read, "Captain Daniels displayed extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty in the face of grave danger, embodying the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and bringing great credit upon herself and the United States Naval Service." My parents had never read that citation. They'd never asked to see it. My third and final deployment, to Syria in 2018, had been the most complex yet. I'd been promoted to major and assigned to a joint task force working to stabilize regions recently liberated from ISIS control. The mission involved coordinating between multiple international partners, managing humanitarian aid distribution, and helping local communities rebuild basic infrastructure while maintaining security against remaining extremist cells. The Purple Heart from that deployment came courtesy of a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device that had targeted our convoy during a humanitarian mission to a Syrian refugee camp. The blast had thrown our armored vehicle 30 feet and left me with a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and shrapnel wounds that required 3 surgeries to fully repair. 2 Marines in the vehicle behind me had been killed instantly. I'd spent 4 months recovering at Walter Reed Medical Center, undergoing physical therapy to regain full use of my left arm and psychological counseling to process what the doctors diplomatically called combat stress reactions. The nightmares had been the worst part, not just from the bombing, but from years of accumulated trauma that my mind had been storing away until the physical injury forced everything to the surface. During those months of recovery, I'd received exactly 2 communications from my family. A generic, "get well soon," card from my mother with no personal message, and a voicemail from my father asking if my injury would affect my military pension. No visits, no phone calls, no expressions of concern for my well-being or pride in my service. My brother Jake had sent a single text message, "Heard you got hurt. Hope you're okay." When I'd replied with details about my injuries and recovery timeline, he'd never responded. The contrast with my military family had been stark. My Marines had visited regularly, bringing books and magazines and stories from the unit to keep me connected. My commanding officers had checked on me personally, ensuring I had everything I needed and that my medical care was progressing properly. Fellow wounded warriors had shared their own experiences and offered practical advice about navigating the recovery process. When I'd finally returned to duty, it was with a new assignment as a training officer at Camp Pendleton, responsible for preparing Marines for deployment to combat zones. It was important work that drew on all my experience, but it was also a clear signal that my days in operational units were over. The military was taking care of me by moving me to a role where my damaged shoulder wouldn't be a liability, but we all understood that my combat career was finished. The final phase of my service had been administrative but fulfilling. I developed new training protocols based on lessons learned from my deployments, written after-action reports that influenced Marine Corps policy, and mentored junior officers who were preparing for their own overseas assignments. When I'd retired in 2021 with the rank of lieutenant colonel, I'd been proud of my contributions to both the Corps and the broader mission of American security. But none of that mattered to my parents. They'd never understood that military service was about more than just personal advancement or steady employment. They'd never grasped that the woman who'd left Millbrook as an 18-year-old recruit had returned as a tested leader who'd proven herself in the most demanding environments on Earth. To them, I was still just their disappointing daughter who'd chosen obligation to strangers over loyalty to family, duty to country over devotion to home. They measured my worth by my absence from family gatherings, not by my presence on foreign battlefields. They counted my failures as a traditional daughter, not my successes as a modern warrior. As I organized my military records that night in the hotel room, I realized that tomorrow's court hearing would be about more than property rights or inheritance law. It would be about whether 22 years of honorable service could coexist with family love, whether sacrifice for the greater good could be recognized as a form of family loyalty, whether choosing the harder path could finally be acknowledged as courage rather than selfishness. The document spread across that hotel bed told the story of a woman who'd served her country with distinction, who'd led others through life-threatening situations, who'd earned the respect of peers and superiors through competence and dedication. Tomorrow, I would have to convince a judge that this same woman deserved to inherit the property her grandmother had left her. But first, I would have to prove to my own family that service to country hadn't made me a stranger to home. The morning after my arrival in Millbrook, I drove out to Sycamore Road before dawn, wanting to see the property in the quiet hours when memory and reality could coexist without the harsh glare of daylight judgment. The house sat on 5 acres at the end of a gravel drive lined with eucalyptus trees that my great-grandfather had planted as windbreaks during the Dust Bowl years. What I found there broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. The house itself was structurally sound, my mortgage payments and maintenance investments had ensured that, but it bore the unmistakable signs of emotional neglect. The front porch where my grandmother used to shell peas and watch for my school bus was cluttered with broken lawn furniture and cardboard boxes that had sat through multiple seasons. The flower beds she'd tended with religious devotion were choked with weeds. The American flag that had flown from the front porch pole since my great-grandfather's death in 1987 was faded and tattered, its edges frayed by years of wind and weather. But it was the workshop behind the main house that truly revealed what this legal battle was really about. My great-grandfather's workshop had been the heart of the property, a cathedral of American craftsmanship where 3 generations of Daniel's men had learned to work with their hands. The walls were lined with tools that dated back to the 1940s, hand planes that could shave wood paper thin, chisels sharp enough to carve initials in oak, measuring devices calibrated to tolerances that modern power tools couldn't match. Thomas Daniels had been a perfectionist who believed that quality work was a form of prayer, and his workshop reflected that philosophy in every carefully organized drawer and precisely hung tool. My grandfather James had added to the collection, incorporating newer equipment while maintaining his father's standards of organization and care. He'd taught me to use those tools during summers when my parents were too busy with their own problems to supervise a curious granddaughter. I'd learned to measure twice and cut once, to respect both the wood and the blade, to understand that true craftsmanship required patience and precision rather than speed and shortcuts. Now the workshop was a monument to abandonment. Tools lay scattered and rusted, their edges dulled by moisture and neglect. The workbenches were buried under piles of my father's failed business ventures, boxes of promotional materials from construction projects that had never materialized, outdated equipment catalogs from companies that had long since gone bankrupt, invoices from suppliers who'd eventually stopped extending credit. The floor was littered with debris from a roof leak that had gone unrepaired for so long that it had created an ecosystem of mold and decay in what had once been a shrine to careful maintenance. This was what my parents considered caring for the family property. This was the stewardship they claimed I had abandoned through my military service. But the workshop told a deeper story than simple neglect. It revealed the fundamental difference between ownership and stewardship, between possession and preservation. My parents had lived on this property for over a decade without truly inhabiting it. They had used it as free housing while allowing its essential character to deteriorate. They had treated it as an asset to be exploited rather than a legacy to be protected. The contrast with my own approach couldn't have been more stark. Every financial decision I'd made regarding this property had been guided by a single question: what would my great-grandfather and grandmother have wanted? When the roof needed replacement, I'd chosen materials that would last 40 years rather than the cheaper option that would need replacement in 15. When the electrical system required updating, I'd insisted on work that exceeded building codes because safety was more important than savings. When the foundation showed signs of settling, I'd hired structural engineers to ensure repairs were done properly rather than cosmetically. I'd made these decisions from military bases around the world, coordinating with contractors through satellite internet connections and video calls from combat zones. I'd approved expenditures while living in barracks and eating meals from military dining facilities, choosing to invest in a property thousands of miles away rather than improving my own immediate living conditions. I'd done this because I understood that stewardship was about serving something larger than personal comfort, about protecting what previous generations had built for the benefit of future generations. The financial records I'd brought to court told only part of this story. The real evidence was in the details that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet, the gutters that drained properly because I'd insisted on professional installation, the foundation that remained level because I'd addressed problems proactively rather than reactively, the electrical system that met modern safety standards because I'd prioritized long-term value over short-term savings. My parents' approach had been exactly the opposite. They deferred maintenance until problems became emergencies, then complained about the costs. They'd chosen the cheapest solutions for immediate problems without considering long-term consequences. They'd treated the property as a source of free housing rather than a responsibility requiring active care. The irony was devastating. They were suing me for abandonment while living in a house I'd maintained and on land I'd protected, surrounded by evidence of their own neglect. Walking through that deteriorated workshop, I realized that this legal battle was about competing definitions of family responsibility. My parents believed that physical presence was the only meaningful form of family loyalty, that geographic proximity was more important than financial contribution or emotional investment. They measured my worth as a family member by my attendance at holiday dinners and birthday parties, not by my willingness to sacrifice personal comfort to protect family assets. I had operated from a different philosophy entirely. I believed that family responsibility meant ensuring the survival and prosperity of what previous generations had built, even if that required personal sacrifice and geographic separation. I measured family loyalty by actions rather than proximity, by contribution rather than attendance, by results rather than rhetoric. The legal documents my parents had filed revealed the depth of their misunderstanding. They claimed I had shown no interest in family responsibilities, while living rent-free in a house whose mortgage I'd been paying. They accused me of failing to maintain familial obligations, while benefiting from maintenance and improvements I'd funded from overseas. They described the property as deteriorating due to defendants' neglect, while sitting in a building whose structural integrity I'd preserved through years of proactive investment. Every accusation was not just false but inverted. They were claiming credit for my contributions while blaming me for their failures. But the workshop also revealed something else, the extent to which my military service had shaped my understanding of stewardship and responsibility. In the Marine Corps, I'd learned that leadership meant taking care of people and equipment even when, especially when, it was difficult or expensive or inconvenient. I'd learned that true ownership wasn't about control but about service, that having authority over something meant being responsible for its welfare. I'd applied those lessons to this property, treating it as I would treat Marines under my command, with the understanding that my role was to protect and improve what had been entrusted to me, regardless of personal cost or convenience. I'd made decisions based on what was best for the long-term welfare of the property rather than what was easiest for my immediate circumstances. My parents had never learned those lessons. They'd approached property ownership as they approached most things, with an eye toward personal benefit rather than broader responsibility. They'd taken what they could get while giving as little as possible in return. Standing in that ruined workshop, surrounded by tools that represented 4 generations of family craftsmanship, I understood that tomorrow's court hearing would determine more than legal ownership. It would determine whether stewardship could be recognized as a form of love, whether sacrifice could be acknowledged as a type of service, whether protecting something from thousands of miles away could be considered more valuable than living next to it while letting it decay. The morning sun was beginning to filter through the broken windows, illuminating particles of dust and decay that hung in the air like memories of better times. I picked up one of my great-grandfather's hand planes, its handle worn smooth by decades of use, and felt the weight of everything that was at stake. This wasn't just about a house and 5 acres of land. It was about the American dream itself, the belief that dedication and sacrifice could create something lasting, that stewardship mattered more than ownership, that service to others, whether in combat zones or family workshops, was the highest form of human achievement. Tomorrow, I would have to convince a judge that these values still mattered in modern America. That evening at the Millbrook Inn, I sat on the narrow bed with my dress blue uniform laid out beside me like a fallen soldier. The jacket was midnight blue wool, its brass buttons polished to a mirror shine that reflected the harsh fluorescent light of the hotel room. The ribbons told a story in colored silk that my family had never bothered to read: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, each one representing moments when I'd chosen duty over safety, service over comfort. Ranger watched me from his position by the window, his intelligent brown eyes tracking my movements as I ran my fingers along the uniform's precise creases. He'd been with me for 6 years now, a rescue dog I'd adopted after my final deployment, and he understood my moods better than most humans. Tonight, he sensed the weight of tomorrow's decision pressing down on me like humidity before a storm. I hadn't worn this uniform since my retirement ceremony 18 months ago at Camp Pendleton. That day had been bittersweet, proud but melancholy, celebratory but final. 22 years of service condensed into a flag-folding ceremony and handshakes with officers who'd become family in ways my blood relatives never had. Afterward, I'd carefully stored the uniform in a garment bag, thinking I might never have cause to wear it again. Now it lay before me like a choice between two different versions of myself: the woman who'd learned to live quietly in civilian clothes, avoiding confrontation and keeping her military service private, or the Marine who'd earned the right to stand tall and speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost. My phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Martinez. "How are you holding up, Daniels? Remember, you've faced worse than family court. Stay strong." He was right, of course. I'd survived IED attacks and sniper fire and the kind of soul-crushing bureaucracy that could break lesser spirits. I'd led Marines through combat zones where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. I'd negotiated with Afghan tribal elders who viewed women as barely human, earning their respect through competence and patience rather than anger or force. But this felt different. Those challenges had been external, clearly defined, with rules of engagement I understood. Tomorrow's battle would be fought in the gray areas of family dynamics and small-town politics, where my uniform might be seen as either armor or provocation, depending on the perspective of the observer. I thought about my conversation with my father the previous day, the casual dismissal in his voice when he described my service as playing army. That phrase had cut deeper than any physical wound I'd received in combat, not because it was cruel. I'd heard worse from drill instructors and enemy combatants, but because it revealed the fundamental chasm between us that 22 years hadn't bridged. To him, my military service was an extended childhood game, a phase I'd never outgrown, a selfish indulgence that had taken me away from my real responsibilities as a daughter and potential wife and mother. He'd never understood that for me, the Marines had been a calling, not a career choice. The uniform represented everything I'd aspired to become: disciplined, capable, worthy of trust in life or death situations. The decision to wear it tomorrow wasn't about intimidation or grandstanding. It was about authenticity. For too many years, I'd allowed my family to define me by their disappointments rather than my achievements. I'd accepted their narrative that my absence from family gatherings was more significant than my presence in places where Marines needed leadership. I'd internalized their judgment that choosing service over suburbia made me somehow deficient as a daughter and a woman. But sitting in that hotel room, surrounded by legal documents that proved my financial responsibility and military records that demonstrated my professional competence, I realized that their narrative had always been a lie designed to protect their own sense of superiority. They needed to believe that my choices had been wrong because acknowledging my success would force them to confront their own failures: my father's failed businesses, my mother's narrow worldview, their collective inability to see beyond the boundaries of Millbrook, California. The uniform represented a different story entirely. A story about a girl who'd refused to accept limitations, who'd earned respect through merit rather than inheritance, who'd proven herself in environments where gender and family connections meant nothing compared to competence and character. Wearing it tomorrow would be an act of truth-telling, a refusal to continue participating in the fiction that my military service had been anything less than honorable. I stood and held the jacket up to the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman looking back at me was older than the 18-year-old who'd first put on Marine Corps fatigues, marked by scars both visible and hidden. But she was also stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth than that nervous recruit had ever been. The uniform didn't make me a different person, it revealed who I'd always been underneath the family expectations and small-town limitations. My phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen, the first time he'd called me back in over 3 years. Amelia? His voice was uncertain, younger than I remembered. I got your message about the lawsuit. Jake. I sat back down on the bed, the uniform jacket still in my hands. I was wondering if you'd call. Look, I don't know all the details about what's going on between you and Mom and Dad, but... He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. I know you've been paying for stuff. The house stuff. Dad mentioned it once when he was drunk. This was news. He did. He said you'd been sending money for years, that he didn't know how they'd manage the property without it. Then the next day he acted like he'd never said anything. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. Why didn't you ever ask me about it? Because I didn't want to get in the middle. I still don't, honestly. But Amelia. Another pause. I looked you up online. After that thing in Syria. I saw the news stories about the bombing, about what you did over there. I waited, not sure what was coming next. I never knew, he said finally. I never knew any of it. The medals, the deployments, the... Jesus, Amelia, you almost died multiple times. It was my job, Jake. No, it wasn't just your job. I read about the women you trained in Afghanistan, about the schools you helped build. I read about you going back into that burning building in Iraq to pull out wounded soldiers. His voice was thick with emotion I'd never heard from him before. I had no idea who my sister really was. The admission hit me like a physical blow. You never asked. I know. None of us ever asked. We assumed you were off doing whatever it is military people do. We never thought about what that actually meant. I stood again and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where families were loading luggage into minivans and preparing for normal civilian adventures that would never require bronze stars or purple hearts. Are you going to wear your uniform tomorrow? Jake asked. The question surprised me. Why do you ask? Because I think you should. I think maybe it's time our family saw who you really are instead of who we wanted you to be. After we hung up, I carefully put on the uniform jacket and stood before the mirror one final time. The ribbons caught the light, each one a small testament to moments when I'd chosen courage over comfort, duty over desire, service over self. The woman in the reflection looked ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. I thought about all the Marines I'd served with who would never wear their uniforms again, who'd given everything in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. I thought about the Afghan women police officers who'd faced death threats for the simple act of showing up to work. I thought about my grandmother, who'd believed in me enough to entrust me with the family legacy even when her own son couldn't see my worth. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom not as my parents' disappointing daughter, but as Lieutenant Colonel Amelia Daniels, United States Marine Corps, retired. I would stand tall and speak truth and let my record speak for itself. The uniform didn't make me brave. It simply revealed the courage that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That moment had finally arrived. The Riverside County Courthouse at 8:30 in the morning hummed with the quiet efficiency of American justice grinding through its daily caseload. Divorce settlements, custody disputes, property disagreements, the endless stream of human conflict that required legal resolution. I arrived 15 minutes early, my dress blues drawing curious glances from attorneys in rumpled suits and families clutching manila folders full of evidence for their own battles. The marble floors echoed with each step of my polished black shoes as I made my way to courtroom 3B. Through the tall windows, morning sunlight streamed across the oak benches and cast long shadows that reminded me of chapel services at military bases around the world. There was something cathedral-like about courtrooms, I realized, places where truth was supposed to matter more than opinion, where evidence carried more weight than emotion. My parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a local man named Wesley Crane, whose billboards promised aggressive representation for Millbrook families. Dad wore his best suit, the navy blue one he'd bought for my high school graduation 24 years ago. It still fit, mostly, though the buttons strained against a belly that spoke of too many beers and not enough physical activity. Mom sat ramrod straight in her church dress, the burgundy one with pearl buttons that she wore to every important occasion. Her hair was freshly set in the style she'd maintained since 1995, and her makeup was applied with the precision of a woman who believed appearances mattered more than authenticity. They didn't look at me when I entered, though I saw my father's shoulders tense when he heard the distinctive sound of military dress shoes on marble. Their attorney glanced up, did a double take at my uniform, then whispered something urgent to my parents. Mom's face went pale beneath her carefully applied foundation. I took my seat at the defendant's table, arranging my files with the same methodical precision I'd used to organize intelligence reports in combat zones. The leather briefcase I'd carried through 3 deployments held 20 years of financial records, property maintenance invoices, and correspondence with contractors who'd kept the Sycamore Road property in pristine condition while I served overseas. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Harrison entered with the bearing of a man who'd spent 30 years separating wheat from chaff in human disputes. He was perhaps 65, with silver hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested he'd seen every variation of family drama the law could address. When his eyes fell on my uniform, I saw recognition flicker across his features, not personal recognition, but the automatic respect one veteran shows another. Case number CV 2024-891, Daniels vs. Daniels, the court clerk announced. Petition for quiet title and declaratory relief. Wesley Crane rose first, his polyester tie catching the fluorescent light as he addressed the court. Your Honor, my clients, Richard and Patricia Daniels, seek legal recognition of their ownership of the family property at 1247 Sycamore Road. The defendant, their daughter Amelia, abandoned this property over 20 years ago when she joined the military and has shown no interest in family responsibilities since that time. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Counselor, the defendant is present in the courtroom. When referring to her, please use proper titles. Crane glanced back at me, clearly flustered. Of course, Your Honor. The defendant, Miss Daniels. Lieutenant Colonel Daniels, Judge Harrison corrected quietly. Let's maintain appropriate respect for military rank in my courtroom. The correction hit my parents like a physical blow. I saw my father's hand clench involuntarily, and my mother's pearl necklace trembled as her breathing became shallow. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't going to unfold according to their script. Crane recovered quickly, launching into his prepared argument. Lieutenant Colonel Daniels has been absent from the family property for over 2 decades. During this time, my clients have maintained the residence, paid utilities, and shouldered the financial burden of property upkeep. They have effectively been subsidizing an absentee owner who has contributed nothing to the family legacy while pursuing her own interests overseas. Every word was a carefully crafted lie, and I felt my Marine Corps training kick in, the ability to remain calm under fire while cataloging enemy positions and preparing counterattacks. I made notes on a legal pad, documenting each false claim for systematic refutation. Furthermore, Crane continued, Lieutenant Colonel Daniels has shown complete disregard for family obligations. She has missed family gatherings, failed to visit during family emergencies, and demonstrated no emotional investment in the property that her grandparents built as a family legacy. Judge Harrison listened without expression, occasionally taking notes of his own. When Crane finished his opening statement, the judge turned to me. Lieutenant Colonel Daniels, you're representing yourself in this matter? Yes, Your Honor. I believe the evidence speaks clearly enough that legal representation isn't necessary. Very well. Your opening statement? I stood, feeling the familiar surge of confidence that came with wearing the uniform. Your Honor, this case is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of both property law and family responsibility. For the past 16 years, I have been the sole financial supporter of the property in question. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every insurance premium, and every major maintenance expense has been paid from my military salary and pension. I opened my briefcase and removed a thick folder. I have documentation proving continuous financial responsibility for this property dating back to 2008, when my parents' financial difficulties made it clear that they could not maintain the mortgage payments on their own. My father's face was turning red, but he remained silent at his attorney's restraining gesture. During my 3 combat deployments, I coordinated property maintenance from overseas, ensuring that the family home remained in excellent condition despite my physical absence. I have receipts for a new roof installed while I was stationed in Syria, plumbing renovations completed during my deployment to Afghanistan, and electrical system upgrades performed while I was serving in Iraq. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. You maintained the property while deployed to combat zones? Yes, Your Honor. I considered it my responsibility as the inheritor of my grandmother's legacy and as a member of the Daniels family, regardless of my geographic location. And your parents were aware of these expenditures? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Your Honor, not only were they aware, they were the direct beneficiaries. They have lived rent-free in the property for over a decade while I covered all ownership costs. When my father's construction business failed in 2008, I quietly assumed the mortgage payments to prevent foreclosure. When my mother required surgery in 2015 and their insurance proved inadequate, I covered the property taxes they could no longer afford. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Crane seemed to have lost his composure, shuffling through papers as if searching for a response that didn't exist. I have bank statements showing automatic transfers from my military accounts to cover property expenses, I continued. I have correspondence with contractors who were instructed to send all bills directly to me while my parents continued to live in the home. I have insurance policies that list me as the responsible party while my parents remained as residents. Judge Harrison was studying my parents now with obvious confusion. Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, were you aware that your daughter was covering the property expenses? My mother opened her mouth but no sound emerged. My father stood partially, then sat back down when Crane placed a restraining hand on his arm. Your Honor, Crane said desperately, my clients maintain that Lieutenant Colonel Daniels chose military service over family responsibilities. Counselor, Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying new steel. Are you suggesting that military service to our country constitutes abandonment of family responsibility? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Crane realized too late that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. Any answer would either insult military service in front of a judge who clearly respected it, or undermine his client's entire case. Not at all, Your Honor. We simply mean that physical presence. Physical presence? Judge Harrison's voice rose slightly. Counselor, are you familiar with Lieutenant Colonel Daniels' service record? No, Your Honor. Judge Harrison turned to me. Lieutenant Colonel, would you briefly summarize your military service for the court? This was my moment. Not for revenge, but for truth. Your Honor, I served 22 years in the United States Marine Corps, including 3 combat deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. I specialized in training local security forces and coordinating humanitarian operations in hostile environments. I was awarded the Bronze Star for heroism during combat operations, the Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and numerous other decorations for meritorious service. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath, could see my father's hands shaking as the reality of my service finally penetrated his willful ignorance. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. And during this service, you maintained financial responsibility for family property? Yes, Your Honor. I considered it my duty as both a Marine and a Daniels family member. Even while under enemy fire? Especially then, Your Honor. The Marines taught me that true leadership means taking care of your people, even when it's difficult. I considered this property and my family to be part of that responsibility. The judge turned back to my parents with barely concealed incredulity. Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, you're asking this court to rule that a decorated combat veteran who has financially maintained your family property for 16 years has somehow abandoned her responsibilities? The battle was over. I could see it in my parents' faces, in their attorney's desperate shuffling through papers, in the way the entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath. But the war for my family's understanding was just beginning. Judge Harrison set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying the documents I'd submitted with the intensity of a commander reviewing battlefield intelligence. The courtroom remained absolutely silent except for the whisper of papers being turned and the barely audible sound of my mother's nervous breathing. "Mr. Crane," the judge said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone sit straighter, "I've reviewed the financial records submitted by Lieutenant Colonel Daniels. The documentation appears comprehensive and irrefutable. Your clients have lived rent-free in a property whose mortgage, taxes, insurance, and major maintenance have been covered by the defendant for 16 years. Can you explain how this constitutes abandonment?" Crane's face had gone pale beneath his spray tan. He shuffled through his papers one more time, clearly searching for an argument that didn't exist. "Your Honor, we maintain that financial contribution doesn't substitute for physical presence and emotional investment." Emotional investment? Judge Harrison's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Counselor, paying someone else's mortgage for 16 years while serving in combat zones seems to demonstrate considerable emotional investment. What evidence do you have that Lieutenant Colonel Daniels lacks emotional connection to this property?" It was then that my father made the mistake that would seal their defeat. Unable to contain himself any longer, he stood up abruptly, ignoring his attorney's restraining gesture. "She left us," he shouted, his voice cracking with 24 years of accumulated resentment. "She walked away from her family to play soldier in countries that don't even matter. She missed her grandmother's funeral, her brother's wedding, every Christmas for the past decade. Money doesn't make up for being a daughter." The words hung in the courtroom air like the smell of cordite after an explosion. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from judicial neutrality to something approaching personal offense. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "please sit down." "She thinks wearing that fancy uniform makes her better than us," my father continued, apparently unable to stop the flood of bitterness that had been building for decades. "She thinks her medals make up for abandoning her family obligations. Well, I don't care how many ribbons she's got. Mr. Daniels, sit down now, or I will hold you in contempt of court." My father finally stopped talking, but the damage was done. His outburst had revealed the ugly truth beneath their legal petition. This wasn't about property ownership or financial responsibility. It was about a father's wounded pride, about parents who couldn't forgive their daughter for choosing a path they didn't understand or approve of. Judge Harrison turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "Lieutenant Colonel Daniels, you mentioned missing family events due to military service. Can you elaborate on those circumstances?" I stood, my voice steady despite the emotional turbulence my father's words had stirred. "Your Honor, I missed my grandmother's funeral in 2015 because I was deployed to Syria with a joint task force providing humanitarian aid to refugee camps. I was leading a team of Marines in an active combat zone where my presence was critical to mission success and the safety of my subordinates." "And your brother's wedding?" "I was in Afghanistan, training female police officers who were receiving daily death threats for their service. 3 of my trainees had been murdered the week before the wedding. I couldn't abandon them at such a critical time." "The Christmas celebrations your father mentioned?" "Various deployments and training exercises over the years, Your Honor. Military service doesn't pause for holidays." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, then did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He stood and walked around to the front of his bench, studying me with the careful attention of one veteran assessing another. "Lieutenant Colonel, I notice you're wearing a Bronze Star ribbon. Can you tell the court how you earned that decoration?" The question wasn't legally relevant to the property dispute, but I understood what he was doing. He was giving me the opportunity to show my parents exactly what they dismissed as playing soldier. "Your Honor, I received the Bronze Star for actions during a humanitarian mission in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A suicide bomber had attacked a school where we were delivering medical supplies and educational materials. The explosion trapped several Afghan children and 2 of my Marines in the collapsed building. I went back into the structure 3 times to extract wounded personnel, despite ongoing small arms fire from insurgents who were attempting to prevent rescue operations." My mother's hand went to her throat, fingers clutching her pearls as if they were a lifeline. The citation specifically mentioned that my actions saved the lives of 6 Afghan children and 2 United States Marines, and that I continued rescue operations despite suffering shrapnel wounds to my leg and shoulder. And the Purple Heart? Vehicle-borne improvised explosive device in Syria, Your Honor. Our convoy was providing security for a humanitarian aid delivery to displaced families. The blast killed 2 Marines and wounded 5 others. I remained conscious long enough to coordinate casualty evacuation and secure the aid supplies before being evacuated myself. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands suspended motionless above her keyboard as if frozen by the weight of what she was hearing. Judge Harrison returned to his seat, his expression grim. Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, you're asking this court to rule that a woman who has served her country with such distinction, who has maintained financial responsibility for your family property while under enemy fire, has somehow failed in her family obligations? My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face and smudging her carefully applied makeup. My father sat slumped in his chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Your Honor, Crane said desperately, my clients acknowledged their daughter's military service, but they maintain that family property should be managed by family members who are physically present. Counselor, Judge Harrison interrupted, your clients have been physically present on this property for 16 years while contributing nothing to its financial maintenance. The defendant has been physically absent while ensuring its continued viability. Which approach better serves the property's long-term interests? Crane had no answer. The legal precedents were clear. Financial responsibility trumped physical presence in property ownership disputes, especially when the absent party was serving military obligations. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He turned to address my parents directly, his voice carrying the authority of both legal judgment and moral indignation. Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, I've been on this bench for 30 years. I've seen every kind of family dispute you can imagine. But I have never seen parents sue a child who has demonstrated such extraordinary dedication to both country and family. Your daughter has sacrificed her personal safety to serve American interests overseas while simultaneously ensuring that your family property remained financially secure. My father tried to speak, but Judge Harrison raised a hand to silence him. She has been wounded in combat while protecting strangers, yet continued to protect your family home from thousands of miles away. She has missed family celebrations because she was saving lives in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. And your response to this service has been to claim that she abandoned you? The judge's voice rose slightly, the careful neutrality of judicial temperament giving way to human emotion. Lieutenant Colonel Daniels has honored both her military oath and her family obligations with a level of dedication that humbles this court. The idea that such service constitutes abandonment is not merely legally frivolous, it is morally offensive. He picked up his gavel, and I knew the moment had arrived. This court finds no merit whatsoever in the plaintiff's petition. The property at 1247 Sycamore Road belongs to Lieutenant Colonel Amelia Daniels, as established by her grandmother's will and confirmed by 16 years of financial stewardship. Furthermore, this court finds that the plaintiff's claims of abandonment are not only unsupported by evidence but contradicted by overwhelming proof of the defendant's responsibility and dedication. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, echoing through the courtroom with the finality of absolute justice. Case dismissed. But as I gathered my papers and prepared to leave, I realized that legal victory was only the first step. The real challenge would be finding a way to bridge the chasm that had just been revealed between my family's expectations and my reality. The uniform had given me the strength to stand tall in that courtroom. Now I had to figure out how to take it off and still remain the person I'd fought so hard to become. The gavel's echo was still ringing in my ears as I packed my briefcase, each document sliding into place with the same precision I'd used to organize supply manifests in combat zones. Victory in court should have felt triumphant, but instead it felt hollow, like winning a firefight where everyone on both sides had been wounded. My parents remained seated at their table, my father staring at his hands while my mother dabbed at her mascara with a tissue that was quickly becoming inadequate for the task. Their attorney, Crane, was already making excuses about appeals and technicalities, but even he seemed to understand that the battle was over. Judge Harrison had delivered more than a legal ruling, he'd handed down a moral judgment that couldn't be overturned by higher courts. As I walked toward the courtroom exit, other people in the gallery began to disperse, their own legal dramas temporarily forgotten in the wake of what they'd just witnessed. I caught fragments of whispered conversations. Did you hear what she did in Syria? 3 deployments and she still paid their mortgage? I had no idea what these military people actually do overseas. The bailiff, a man about my father's age with a military bearing that suggested prior service, caught my eye as I passed. He gave me a subtle nod, the kind of wordless acknowledgement that passes between veterans who understand what service actually costs. No words were necessary, his expression said everything that needed to be said. Outside the courthouse, the California sun was brutally bright after the dim fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. I paused on the marble steps, blinking away the glare and trying to process what had just happened. Legally, the matter was settled. Emotionally, everything remained in ruins. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake, heard about the court hearing from Mom. Are you okay? I typed back, the property stays with me. Everything else is complicated. Want to talk? For the first time in years, I actually did want to talk to my brother. Maybe later. Processing right now. I was halfway to my rental car when I heard footsteps behind me on the courthouse steps. My mother's voice, smaller and more fragile than I'd heard it since childhood, called my name. Amelia, please. Wait. I turned around. She stood alone on the steps, having apparently left my father inside with their attorney. Her carefully styled hair was disheveled from her hands running through it, and her makeup was a disaster of streaked mascara and smudged lipstick. She looked older than her 63 years, worn down by the weight of what she'd just learned about her daughter's life. Mom. I kept my voice neutral, professional. After 24 years of disappointment, I'd learned not to expect sudden transformations. I need to say something. She came down 2 more steps, close enough that I could see the genuine distress in her eyes. In there, when the judge was talking about what you did overseas, about the bombing and the children you saved. She stopped, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. What about it? I never knew. The admission came out as barely a whisper. 22 years, and I never knew any of it. You never asked, Mom. She flinched as if I'd struck her. I know. I know we never asked. But Amelia, we thought, your father always said you were just doing paperwork on some base somewhere, that the military was mostly just bureaucracy and training exercises. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or emotional theater, but found only genuine shock and regret. Mom, I was wounded in combat 3 times. I have scars on my shoulder and leg from shrapnel. Did you think I got those from paperwork? You never told us you were hurt. The words burst out of her with surprising force. When you came home that last time, you said you'd injured your shoulder in training. You never said it was from a bomb. This stopped me cold. She was right. When I'd returned from Syria with my Purple Heart injuries, I'd told them I'd hurt myself during a training exercise. I'd been protecting them from the reality of my service, shielding them from knowledge I thought they couldn't handle or didn't want to hear. I didn't think you'd want to know the details. Not want to know? Her voice cracked. Amelia, you're my daughter. Of course I'd want to know if you were in danger. Would you? Because every time I tried to talk about my service, Dad would change the subject or make jokes about me playing army. Every time I mentioned deployments, you'd ask when I was coming home to settle down and find a nice boy. You made it clear that my military career was something you tolerated, not something you were proud of. She was crying again, but these tears were different from the courtroom dramatics. These carried the weight of genuine recognition. We were wrong. God help me, we were so wrong. A group of people exited the courthouse behind us, their voices echoing off the marble columns as they discussed their own legal victories and defeats. Normal people with normal problems, families fighting over money and property without the complication of bronze stars and purple hearts. Mom, I need to understand something. Why now? Why are you and Dad trying to take the house now, after all these years? She wiped her nose with the tissue, leaving streaks of foundation on the white paper. Your father's been struggling since his business closed down completely last year. We've been living on Social Security and his small pension, and it's not enough. The house is the only asset we have left. But I've been paying for everything. The mortgage, the taxes, the insurance. I know that now. But your father, he has his pride, Amelia. He's never been comfortable accepting help, especially from. She trailed off. From his daughter who chose the military over marriage? From anyone. But especially from you, because accepting your help meant admitting that you'd been more successful than he was. It meant acknowledging that your choices were better than the life he'd planned for you. This was the most honest conversation I'd had with my mother in decades, and it was happening on courthouse steps while she looked like she'd been through a natural disaster. There was something both tragic and appropriate about the setting. So you decided to sue me instead of asking for help? Wesley Crane told us we had a good case, that abandoned property reverts to the next of kin. Your father convinced himself that you really had abandoned us, that you'd chosen your military career over family loyalty. It was easier for him to believe that than to admit we needed our daughter's financial support. A police car drove by with its lights flashing but no siren, heading towards some emergency that would be resolved by people who understood duty and responsibility. I watched it disappear around the corner before responding. Mom, I never abandoned the family. I just refused to abandon myself. She nodded, fresh tears starting. I'm beginning to understand that. But Amelia, your father, he's not going to change overnight. This humiliation in court, having his failures exposed in front of strangers, finding out that his daughter is a war hero while he's been calling her military service a waste of time, it's going to be hard for him. It's been hard for me too, Mom. 24 years of being treated like a disappointment because I chose to serve something bigger than Millbrook, California. I know, and I'm sorry. But what happens now? Do we just never speak again? Do you walk away from us completely? The question hung between us like smoke from a battlefield, carrying the weight of 2 decades of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. I thought about Judge Harrison's words, about honor and duty and what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. I don't know, Mom. I honestly don't know. But I do know that I'm not going to keep pretending that my service was somehow wrong or selfish. And I'm not going to apologize for becoming someone you didn't expect me to be. She reached out tentatively, her hand hovering near my arm before pulling back. Can we try? To understand each other, I mean? To be a family again? That depends on whether Dad can accept that his daughter turned out to be someone he didn't plan for. And whether you can both accept that loving your country and serving in combat doesn't make someone less of a daughter. We'll try, she said. I promise we'll try. As I drove away from the courthouse, I could see her in my rearview mirror, still standing on the steps, looking smaller and more lost than I'd ever seen her. Victory felt like ashes in my mouth, but perhaps that was appropriate. In war, even winning battles came with casualties that couldn't be undone. The real test would be whether my family could learn to see their daughter as someone worth being proud of, rather than someone who'd failed to meet their expectations. 2 weeks after the courthouse victory, I found myself standing in the overgrown driveway of 1247 Sycamore Road with a pickup truck full of cleaning supplies and the kind of determination that had gotten me through Marine Corps boot camp. The property looked even more neglected in daylight than it had during my pre-dawn reconnaissance, but underneath the accumulated debris and cosmetic decay, the bones of my great-grandfather's craftsmanship remained solid. Ranger supervised from the shade of the eucalyptus trees, his tail thumping against the dry grass whenever I looked his way. He'd adapted to civilian life better than I had, finding contentment in simple pleasures like chasing squirrels and sleeping in patches of sunlight. Sometimes I envied his ability to live entirely in the present moment, unencumbered by the weight of family expectations or military memories. The first task was clearing the front porch of the accumulated junk my parents had allowed to pile up over the years. Broken lawn furniture, cardboard boxes that had disintegrated in multiple rainy seasons, garden tools that had rusted beyond salvation, everything spoke of people who'd given up on maintenance and hope in equal measure. Each piece of debris I loaded into the dumpster I'd rented felt like exorcising years of neglect and resentment. By noon, my uniform blouse was soaked with sweat and my dress blue trousers were streaked with dirt and rust stains. I'd changed out of the formal uniform after returning from court, but I'd kept the military-issued undershirt, finding comfort in the familiar feel of regulation cotton against my skin. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept you alive in hostile environments. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of rotted decking when I heard a car engine turning into the driveway. My brother Jake's silver sedan navigated carefully around the dumpster and parked next to my rental truck. He emerged wearing khakis and a polo shirt that screamed regional sales manager, his appearance as carefully managed as his career trajectory had always been. "Jesus, Amelia," he said, surveying the chaos of restoration materials scattered across the yard. "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" "It's called finishing what you start," I replied, not pausing in my work. "Something the Marines taught me." He picked his way carefully across the debris-strewn ground, obviously concerned about his leather shoes. "Mom called me. She said you two talked after the hearing." "We did." I straightened up, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my work gloves. She seemed genuinely surprised to learn that military service involves actual danger. Jake winced. "Look, I know we haven't been the most supportive family. But you have to understand, we never really knew what you were doing over there. Dad always said military deployments were mostly about showing the flag and doing humanitarian work." Dad was wrong about a lot of things. I resumed prying up the rotted board, channeling my frustration into productive physical labor. But that's not entirely his fault. I never corrected his assumptions because I didn't think you'd want to hear the reality. What was the reality? The question stopped me mid-swing with the crowbar. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He was 41 now, soft around the middle from desk work and suburban comfort, but his eyes held genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive indifference I'd grown accustomed to from my family. "You really want to know?" "Yeah, I do. After what happened in court, after hearing what Judge Harrison said about your service. I realized I don't actually know my sister at all." I set down the crowbar and walked over to sit on the tailgate of the pickup truck, gesturing for him to join me. Ranger trotted over and settled at my feet, sensing that the tone of conversation had shifted to something requiring his supportive presence. The reality was that I spent 3 years in combat zones where people were actively trying to kill me and my Marines. I coordinated supply convoys through territory controlled by insurgents who planted bombs specifically designed to maximize casualties. I trained women in Afghanistan who received death threats for the crime of wanting to serve their communities as police officers. I evacuated wounded civilians from buildings that were still taking sniper fire. Jake listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. In Syria, I was part of a joint task force working with refugee camps where families had fled ISIS control. These weren't theoretical humanitarian missions, Jake. These were operations where we distributed food to children who hadn't eaten in days, where we provided medical care to people who'd been tortured for opposing extremist rule, where we protected families whose only crime was refusing to accept religious fanaticism. "And you got wounded doing this work?" 3 times. The Purple Heart was for the worst one, a vehicle bomb that killed 2 of my Marines and left me with shrapnel in my shoulder and leg. But there were smaller injuries too, ones that didn't rate formal recognition. Cuts from broken glass during building searches, bruises from body armor during firefights, the kind of accumulated damage that comes from spending years in environments where violence is routine. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mountains visible beyond the property line. "Why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" "Because every time I came home, you all made it clear that you wanted me to be someone else. Dad wanted me to quit the Marines and work in his construction business. Mom wanted me to find a husband and settle down in Millbrook. You wanted me to stop being so serious about everything and just enjoy life like normal people. We thought we were looking out for you. No, you were looking out for your own comfort. Having a daughter and sister in combat zones was inconvenient for your narrative about family life. It was easier to pretend I was doing safe, boring work than to acknowledge that your family member was serving in dangerous places for important reasons." A hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with the kind of effortless grace I'd once envied during long patrols in desert terrain. Military life had taught me to appreciate moments of natural beauty amid human chaos, to find peace in small observations that connected me to something larger than immediate circumstances. "The worst part," I continued, "wasn't the physical danger or even the wounds. It was coming home to a family that treated my service like an extended vacation that I'd eventually grow out of. It was being introduced to neighbors as your sister who worked for the government rather than as a Marine officer who'd led troops in combat. It was watching Dad dismiss 22 years of honorable service as playing soldier. He was wrong to say that. Yes, he was. But Jake, it wasn't just wrong, it was insulting to everyone who's ever worn the uniform. When he trivializes military service, he's not just dismissing me. He's dismissing every man and woman who's ever sacrificed personal comfort for national security. Jake picked up a handful of gravel from the driveway and threw it toward the trees, his gesture carrying the weight of years of accumulated regret. I looked up your unit online after the court hearing. I read about Operation Enduring Freedom and the casualty statistics from your deployments. I had no idea how dangerous it actually was. Most people don't. That's not necessarily their fault, but it becomes a problem when ignorance turns into judgment. When people assume that because they don't understand military service, it must not be important or dangerous or meaningful. What do you need from us now? From the family, I mean? The question was simpler than the answer. I thought about my conversation with my mother on the courthouse steps, about the genuine shock in her eyes when she learned about my combat service. Change was possible, but it required more than good intentions. I need you to stop trying to make me into someone I never was. I need recognition that choosing military service wasn't a failure of family loyalty, but a different expression of the same values that built this property. I need understanding that serving in combat zones wasn't selfish adventurism, but responsibility to something larger than personal comfort. And if Dad can't give you that? I looked at the house my great-grandfather had built with his own hands after returning from World War II, at the workshop where he'd taught me that quality work was a form of honor, at the land that represented 4 generations of family sacrifice and dedication. Then I'll keep honoring what this place represents, even if he can't. The property stays in family hands, maintained by someone who understands that stewardship requires sacrifice. Whether that happens with his blessing or despite his opposition is up to him. Jake nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning in his expression. You're not going to apologize for who you became. I'm not. I'm proud of who I became. I'm proud of the Marines I served with, proud of the missions we accomplished, proud of the people we protected and helped. If that makes me different from the daughter Dad wanted, then he needs to decide whether he can love the daughter he actually has. As Jake drove away an hour later, promising to talk to our parents about family expectations and military reality, I returned to the work of restoration. Each board I replaced, each surface I cleaned, each repair I completed was an act of faith that honoring the past could coexist with embracing the future, faith that family love could eventually transcend family disappointment. The sun was setting behind the mountains when I finally stopped for the day, my body exhausted but my spirit oddly peaceful. Ranger and I sat on the newly cleaned porch, watching the sky turn from gold to purple while crickets began their evening chorus. Tomorrow I would continue the restoration, continue the slow work of rebuilding both property and relationships. But tonight, for the first time since returning to Millbrook, I felt like I was truly home. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of Millbrook High School's auditorium, looking out at an audience of teenagers who fidgeted in their seats with the restless energy of youth confronting uncomfortable truths about adulthood. The invitation to speak at their Veterans Day assembly had come from Mrs. Rodriguez, the history teacher who'd read about my court case in the local newspaper and thought my story might resonate with students facing their own choices about military service. The restored dress blue uniform felt different now, not like armor for battle, but like formal attire for ceremony. The ribbons and medals caught the stage lights as I adjusted the microphone, each decoration representing not just personal achievement but the collective sacrifice of everyone who'd served alongside me in places most of these kids couldn't locate on a map. How many of you have family members who've served in the military? I asked. About a third of the hands went up, a higher percentage than I'd expected in small-town California, but consistent with communities where economic opportunity often comes through military service rather than college education or family businesses. And how many of you know exactly what those family members did during their service? Most of the hands went down. A few students looked uncomfortable, probably recognizing themselves in the description of families who supported military service in theory while remaining ignorant about its practical realities. 6 months ago, I discovered that my own parents, after 22 years of my military service, had no idea what I'd actually done overseas. They knew I'd been deployed multiple times, but they thought deployment meant sitting safely on a base somewhere, probably doing paperwork and waiting to come home. A few students chuckled, but most remained attentively silent. These kids had grown up during the global war on terror. Military deployment wasn't an abstract concept to them. The disconnect between military families and civilian families isn't anyone's fault, exactly. But it becomes a problem when ignorance turns into judgment, when people assume that because they don't understand military service, it must not be important or dangerous or meaningful. In the front row, I spotted Mrs. Rodriguez nodding approvingly. Behind her, scattered throughout the auditorium, I could see my family, my parents in the third row, my brother Jake with his wife Sarah, even some neighbors I'd known since childhood. My mother had called 2 weeks ago to ask if they could attend, her voice carrying the same tentative hope I'd heard on the courthouse steps. I want to talk to you today about service, not just military service, but any choice to dedicate your life to something larger than personal comfort or immediate gratification. Because the lesson I learned from 22 years in the Marine Corps isn't that everyone should join the military. It's that everyone should find something worth serving. My father sat stiffly in his seat, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to court 6 months earlier. He'd aged visibly since the hearing, his hair grayer and his shoulders more stooped, but his presence here represented progress I couldn't have imagined during our bitter courtroom confrontation. When I enlisted at 18, my family thought I was making a mistake. They had a different vision of my life, marriage, children, staying close to home, following traditional paths that would keep me safe and comfortable. They weren't wrong to want those things for me. They were wrong to assume that safety and comfort were more important than purpose and contribution. The restoration of the Sycamore Road property had taken 4 months of weekends and vacation days, but it had become more than just home improvement. It had become a form of meditation, a way of working through 24 years of family conflict with hammer and saw and paintbrush. My parents had begun visiting during the final weeks, first offering tentative suggestions, then actual help. I learned something important during my military service, the difference between serving yourself and serving something larger than yourself. When you serve only yourself, your achievements are limited by your own capabilities and ambitions. When you serve something larger, whether it's your country, your community, your family, or your principles, your impact extends far beyond what you could accomplish alone. In the audience, I could see some students taking notes while others stared at their phones. But a significant number were listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested the message was landing where it needed to. Military service taught me that real strength isn't about being tougher than everyone else. It's about being reliable when others depend on you, about making difficult decisions under pressure, about continuing to serve even when service requires personal sacrifice. The high school auditorium felt smaller than the courtroom had 6 months ago, but the stakes felt equally high. These students would soon face choices about college, careers, relationships, military service. Some would choose paths that disappointed their families. Others would follow expectations that limited their potential. All of them would have to decide what kind of adults they wanted to become. After my retirement from the Marines, I thought my service was over. But I learned that service is a way of approaching life, not just a career choice. When my family's property was threatened, I served by protecting what previous generations had built. When my relationship with my parents was damaged, I served by choosing reconciliation over resentment. My mother was crying quietly in her seat, but these were different tears from the ones she'd shed on courthouse steps. These carried pride rather than shame, understanding rather than confusion. The uniform I'm wearing today isn't a costume or a prop. It represents values that extend far beyond military service: duty, honor, courage, commitment, integrity. These aren't military values, they're human values that military service helped me understand and develop. After the assembly, students approached me with questions that revealed both their curiosity about military life and their uncertainty about their own futures. A senior named Marcus asked about the difference between serving in the Army versus the Marines. A sophomore named Emma wanted to know if women really faced combat in modern warfare. A junior named David wondered whether military service would interfere with college plans or enhance them. I answered each question honestly, emphasizing that military service was one path among many for young people seeking purpose and direction. The goal wasn't to recruit for the armed forces but to encourage these students to consider service, in whatever form, as a worthy life choice. As the crowd dispersed, my parents approached the stage with the careful steps of people navigating unfamiliar territory. My father looked older but somehow more solid, as if months of confronting uncomfortable truths about his daughter had forced him to reassess his own values and assumptions. "That was a good speech," he said, his voice carrying none of the dismissive edge I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Thank you, Dad. I've been thinking about what you said in court, about serving something bigger than yourself." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to a man who'd spent decades focused primarily on personal survival and family expectations. I think maybe I forgot what that meant, somewhere along the way. My mother stepped closer, reaching out to touch one of the ribbons on my uniform jacket. "I want to understand these," she said quietly. "All of them. What they mean, what you did to earn them, what we should have known all along." "We have time now," I said. "We have all the time we need." That evening, we sat on the restored porch of the Sycamore Road property, sharing coffee and stories as the sun set behind the mountains. For the first time in 24 years, I told my family the complete truth about my military service, not just the heroic moments that had earned decorations, but the daily challenges of leadership, the weight of responsibility for other people's lives, the personal cost of choosing duty over comfort. They listened without judgment or interruption, and I realized that the reconciliation I'd been seeking wasn't about them accepting my choices. It was about all of us learning to see each other as complete human beings rather than collections of disappointed expectations. Ranger dozed at my feet while crickets provided soundtrack for conversations that should have happened years earlier. The house my great-grandfather had built stood solid and secure around us, its walls holding not just 4 generations of family history but the promise of future generations who might understand that service and family love weren't competing values but complementary expressions of the same fundamental commitment to something larger than individual comfort. The uniform hanging in my bedroom closet would always represent the Marine I'd been and the values I'd learned through military service. But the real victory wasn't in wearing it to court or to school assemblies. The real victory was in finally taking it off and discovering that the person underneath, the daughter, sister, and steward of family legacy, was someone worth being proud of, with or without military decorations. As my parents prepared to leave that night, my father turned back at the door with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pride, exactly, but something deeper and more valuable, respect. "Your great-grandfather would be proud of you," he said. "Not just for your military service, but for bringing this family back together. For serving all of us, even when we didn't deserve it." The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, finally giving me what I'd spent 24 years seeking, not approval of my choices, but recognition of the person those choices had helped me become. Sometimes the longest distance between 2 points isn't geographical. Sometimes it's the space between expectation and acceptance, between disappointment and love, between the family you're born into and the family you choose to serve, no matter how difficult that service might be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.